Iran is doing absolutely no business, and we're going to keep it that way very easily.
U.S. President Donald Trump has threatened to destroy any ships that approach the blockade. So far, Iran's threshold for pain seems.
Welcome to the NewsHour. Iranian forces attacked and seized at least 2 ships in the contested Strait of Hormuz today as a standoff over when or whether to return to negotiations continued.
The ambush was not the disaster America remembers. It was the trap that revealed Washington had walked into someone else's war. At 3:42 p.m., a handful of Delta operators dropped into Mogadishu believing they had 1 hour to snatch 2 lieutenants of Mohammed Farah aided. 1 hour. But somewhere inside the Baqara market, a different clock had already started. Burning tires, radio calls, men with RPGs moving through alleys so narrow a Humvee could barely turn. And the question nobody in the command center could answer was terrifyingly simple. Who warned them? Because within minutes, a Ranger blocking force was surrounded, the convoy was bleeding men, and the most powerful military on Earth was trapped in a city that had turned itself into a weapon. Watch this closely. The official mission was a raid. The real mission became survival. And by nightfall, 2 Delta snipers would make a decision so impossible that Washington would spend the next 30 years trying to explain what happened in those streets. Mogadishu was not supposed to be a battlefield anymore. By October 1993, the United States had already done the part that looked clean on television. Marines had landed on beaches. Food convoys had moved. Starving children had been filmed receiving sacks of grain stamped with American markings. That was the surface story. Under it sat the Rayal board. Somalia had no functioning state. Warlords controlled neighborhoods like private kingdoms. Clan militias taxed food, controlled roads, and turned humanitarian routes into bargaining chips. And in South Mogadishu, the most important name was Mohammed Farah aided. Not a ghost. Not a terrorist caricature. A former general. A political survivor. A man who understood something Washington underestimated. In a city of alleys, markets, clans, and informants, helicopters do not create surprise forever. Every raid teaches the enemy. Remember that. Task Force Ranger had been sent to cut the head off Aided's network. The force was elite, Delta Force, Rangers from the 75th Ranger Regiment, Night Stalker helicopters from the 160th SOAR, Air Force combat controllers, and SEALs. On paper, it looked surgical. But surgery only works when the patient does not move. By October 3rd, the Somalis had studied the pattern. Helicopters over the city. Rangers roping down to SEAL streets. Delta operators hitting a target building. Convoys racing in to extract prisoners. The Americans had speed. The Somalis had repetition. And repetition is intelligence. At the airfield that afternoon, the plan looked almost routine. Intelligence pointed to a meeting near the Olympic Hotel. 2 of Aided's senior men were believed to be inside, Omar Salad Elmi and Mohammed Hassan Awail. The order came. Irene. 16 helicopters lifted over Mogadishu. Black Hawks carrying Rangers. Little Birds carrying Delta. Above them, surveillance watched the city breathe. Below them, the city was already watching back. The first strange sign was smoke. Tires burning in the streets. To an outsider, it looked like chaos. To the militia, it was a warning system. A low-tech alarm grid spreading faster than any radio net. 1 tire becomes 3. 3 become 10. In minutes, whole blocks know the Americans are coming. And here is the first trap. The raid succeeded. Delta hit the building. The targets were captured. The Rangers took their corners. The prisoners were loaded. That should have been the end. But the city had not been defending the building. It had been waiting for the exit. The first bullets came in scattered. Then heavier. Then from every angle. AK fire from windows. RPG teams shifting across rooftops. Militia fighters and armed volunteers pouring toward the sound of helicopters. For the Rangers on the ground, time changed shape. A street corner became a fortress. A doorway became cover. A second-story window became a death sentence. The convoy was supposed to drive in clean, pick up the prisoners, and pull everyone back to the airport. Instead, it rolled into a maze. Colonel Danny McKnight's vehicles moved through streets that seemed to rearrange themselves. Roadblocks appeared. Tires burned. Crowds blocked intersections. Gunfire came from places the maps could not explain. And then the first Black Hawk was hit. Super 6-1. An RPG rose from the city and struck the tail rotor. The helicopter spun, lost control, and fell into Mogadishu. A mission that had been measured in minutes was now measured in crash sites. Silence. Then every radio came alive. The crash changed everything. Rangers and Delta operators had to move to the wreck. The convoy had to redirect. The air mission had to become a rescue mission. And the militia understood the same thing at the same moment. The Americans would not leave their dead or wounded. So the crash site became bait. This is where the numbers turn brutal. Roughly 160 Americans had gone into the city on the initial raid. Around them, hundreds of armed Somalis were converging block by block. Some were organized militia. Some were clan fighters. Some were citizens pulled by anger, fear, or revenge. 500 was not a clean military formation. It was a human flood. And it kept growing. At the first crash site, Staff Sergeant Daniel Bush and Sergeant Jim Smith fought from the wreckage and nearby cover. Rangers pushed toward them. Delta operators moved through alleys. Helicopters circled low enough for pilots to see muzzle flashes. The AH-6 Little Birds began firing into the streets. Not from far away. Low, close, violent. Their miniguns cut across intersections where militia fighters were massing. Rockets punched into technical vehicles. The sound became part of the city's memory. Rotors, gunfire, screams, engines, radio calls. But air power could punish. It could not hold a street corner forever. And now the second loop opens. Why was there no armor ready? Because before the raid, Task Force Ranger had asked for heavier support, tanks, armored vehicles, AC-130 gunships. Washington had said no. The political signal mattered. The United States did not want Somalia to look like a widening war. So when the trap sprang, the rescue force had to improvise with Humvees and trucks, thin-skinned vehicles, in a city firing down from every window. At around 4:40 p.m., another RPG hit another Black Hawk, Super 6-4. Chief Warrant Officer Michael Durant's helicopter went down deeper in the city, away from the main American position. Now there were 2 crash sites, 2 magnets, 2 clocks, and one terrible realization: the Americans did not have enough men to protect both. Above the city, 2 Delta snipers watched the second crash site from another helicopter. Master Sergeant Gary Gordon and Sergeant First Class Randy Sugart could see what was happening below. Durant was alive. The wreck was vulnerable. Militia fighters were closing in. They asked to be inserted. Denied. They asked again. Denied. The command understood the math. 2 men against a city was not reinforcement. It was almost certain death. They asked a third time. This time, permission came. Gordon and Sugart went down. Remember those names. Because this is the moment the battle stopped being about a failed raid and became something older than politics. 2 soldiers choosing to stand between a wounded pilot and a crowd coming to kill him. They pulled Durant from the wreckage. They armed him. They took positions. Then they fought. 1 rifle. Then another. Moving around the wreck. Firing, repositioning, reloading. Buying seconds. Then minutes. Then more minutes than anyone had a right to expect. But ammunition is a clock. And theirs was running out. Across the city, the main Ranger and Delta force was also pinned. The convoy trying to reach them kept getting shredded. Men were hit inside vehicles. Drivers were wounded. Streets were misread. Turns were missed. Every block demanded a decision, and every decision cost blood. This is what urban combat does. It takes elite units and forces them into 10-foot problems. A jammed weapon. A wounded man behind a wall. A wrong turn. A rooftop. A child crossing a street. A doorway that may hold a family or a fighter. By sunset, the Americans were no longer conducting a raid. They were holding islands in hostile terrain. The first crash site became a defensive perimeter. Rangers and Delta operators occupied nearby buildings. Wounded men were treated on floors slick with dust and blood. Ammunition was counted. Water ran low. Night came down. And the city did not stop. At the second crash site, Gordon and Sugart were eventually overrun. Michael Durant was captured alive. Gordon and Sugart were killed after holding the site against impossible odds. They would later receive the Medal of Honor. But in the moment, nobody in the main perimeter knew the full story. Only fragments. A pilot captured. A crash site lost. A city closing in. And still, no armored rescue had arrived. The rescue force that finally came was not just American. That detail often gets buried, but it matters. Pakistani tanks. Malaysian armored personnel carriers. U.S. troops from the 10th Mountain Division. A multinational column assembled in the dark because the original force did not have the armor it needed when the first helicopter fell. That is the hidden move inside the battle. Aided's men did not need to defeat Delta Force in a clean fight. They needed to stretch the Americans long enough for politics to enter the room. Every hour the battle continued, Washington lost control of the story. Every body in the street became strategy. Every burning vehicle became leverage. This was not just a firefight. It was information warfare before the phrase became fashionable. Around midnight, the armored column pushed toward the trapped Americans. The rout was brutal. RPGs slammed into vehicles. Gunmen attacked from both sides. The column had to fight its way forward block by block. Inside the perimeter, the Rangers and Delta operators heard engines in the distance. Then gunfire. Then closer engines. Rescue was coming, but not cleanly. Some of the wounded were loaded into vehicles. Some men could not fit. Others had to move on foot beside the convoy as it pulled out under fire. That movement became known as the Mogadishu Mile. It was not really a neat 1-mile formation. It was a desperate breakout through hostile streets by exhausted men who had been fighting through the night. Some ran, some staggered, some covered others. Vehicles moved ahead toward the Pakistani stadium. Dawn exposed the cost. 18 Americans were dead from the battle. Dozens wounded. 1 pilot captured. Somali casualties were far higher, with estimates ranging into the hundreds. 2 Black Hawks destroyed. A mission meant to last about an hour had become an 18-hour urban battle. And here is the part that still unsettles military planners. Tactically, Task Force Ranger captured the men it was sent to capture. Strategically, Aided won the screen. Images of dead American soldiers dragged through Mogadishu reached televisions around the world. Public support collapsed. The United States pulled Task Force Ranger out that same month. By 1994, American forces were leaving Somalia. By 1995, the UN mission was gone. The battlefield was a few city blocks. The consequence reached Washington, the Pentagon, Africa, and eventually every intervention debate that came after. Mogadishu taught America a lesson it did not want to learn. Elite soldiers can win every room, every rooftop, every trigger pull, and still lose the political battle if the enemy controls the clock, the crowd, and the camera. That was Aided's deeper play. Not to destroy Delta Force. Not to annihilate the Rangers. But to make the price of staying look higher than the value of the mission. And it worked. But there is one final truth buried under the headlines. The men on the ground did not experience Mogadishu as policy. They experienced it as a corner they had to hold. A friend they had to carry. A crash site they had to reach. A radio call they hoped someone could answer. For them, the battle was not about Somalia strategy. It was about the next 10 seconds. Reload. Move. Drag him. Cover that window. Don't stop. That is why the story refuses to disappear. Because the official version says the mission went wrong when the helicopters fell. But the real story is darker. The mission went wrong before takeoff, when Washington mistook speed for control, intelligence for certainty, and elite force for political clarity. Mogadishu was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of assumptions. The Rangers held. Delta fought. The pilots came back again and again through fire that should have kept them away. Gordon and Sugart chose the crash site over survival. No one can take that from them. But bravery is not a strategy. And in Mogadishu, bravery was asked to pay for decisions made far above the street. That is the part most retellings avoid. The ambush was not just 500 armed men surrounding a platoon. It was a city teaching a superpower that the enemy gets a vote. And 30 years later, whenever American planners look at a hostile capital and say, "We can be in and out in 1 hour," Mogadishu whispers back the same answer. Maybe. But who controls our 2?